Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar all about the coronavirus and the legal implications for employers and carriers. We have over 300 attendees joining us today. We're super excited to have you with us. My name is Susie Belanger, and I am the Director of Marketing for Ford Richardson. Today, we are delighted to have Dr. James Shepard. He is the Associate Professor of Internal Medicine, Infectious Diseases at the Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Shepard is on the front lines now seeing patients with coronavirus. However, he recently returned from overseas, spending some time in India, advising the government there on the control of tuberculosis. He's also spent time in Nigeria and Botswana. So we're very, very pleased to have Dr. Shepard with us today. Part 2 of the webinar is going to be a discussion of the legal implications of the coronavirus for employers and carriers, and that will be led by Scott Ford and Brian Richardson. Before I turn you over to the presenters, I did want to let you know that this video is being recorded, and we will share that with all our registrants after the event. And also, if you have any questions, please leave them in the Q&A section located on your screen. We will get to as many as we can. We did receive quite a few questions in advance, but we'll try to answer them as we go along. So now I will turn you over to our presenters.
Very good. Thank you, Susie, and thank you particularly Dr. Shepard. We know you're on the front line there at Yale, and we appreciate the work that you're doing with this terrible pandemic, and we appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and that you've made yourself available to share some information with our audience. We thought we would begin, if you would, Dr. Shepard, with just a brief presentation with respect to when the novel coronavirus developed, what exactly it is, and just some general overview to get started.
Yeah, good morning, or good afternoon, just, and thanks for inviting me. This is another coronavirus. You'll be aware that there have been 2 prior coronavirus epidemics within the last 20 years, SARS, MERS, and now this coronavirus, which we're calling SARS-2, because it indicates its close relationship to the original SARS that caused a global epidemic 18 years ago. This new coronavirus emerged from central China, the vicinity of Wuhan in central China, in mid to late November last year. Most likely it jumped in a single event from one animal host into a human, and probably somebody associated with capturing and selling live animals, wild animals in the seafood market in Wuhan. The first outbreak of human-to-human transmission, so a cluster of human sickness with this virus, was recognized on the 8th of December in Wuhan city by the Chinese authorities, who announced a new outbreak with a newly identified virus on 31st of December 2019, so the last day of last year. And after that, the share of information between Chinese doctors and scientists and the rest of the world has been really very good. And we knew the complete DNA or RNA sequence, because it's a ribonucleic acid virus, on the 7th of January, a week after the initial announcement. So we could see every single base pair in its genome. We knew exactly what sort of virus it was, how closely related to SARS, the original coronavirus epidemic 18 years ago. But the big difference between this virus and the original SARS is that it is well adapted to Homo sapiens, us, and replicates very efficiently in the human upper airway. And so it can be transmitted very efficiently in communities. And I think we'll wait for the next question, but from what I've told you already, you can see basically it had the characteristics to spread across the world to the point that we're now in today.
Very good. Thank you for that brief introduction. I know Brian and I are going to ask you a series of questions, and we'll be taking questions from our live audience as well. So we encourage folks to bring those questions in as we see them, we'll read them. But you mentioned, Dr. SARS-1. Obviously, that was the earlier pandemic. How does SARS-2 or the novel coronavirus compare to it, as well as earlier pandemics such as H1N1 and MERS?
So as I mentioned, this virus is much better adapted to us, its brand new host. So it has a much higher R number, which is a factor that you've heard bandied around probably in the press. It's an epidemiological coefficient that measures the efficiency of transmission of a virus. And any R number or replication number greater than 1 indicates that this epidemic will increase, because more than one new patient is infected for every known patient. And this virus appears to have an R value initially around 3. So there are 3 new cases for every case. And this is occurring in the community. If you think back to the original SARS, nearly all the cases were associated with healthcare facilities, hospitals, and in nearly all the transmission was from inpatients who were already quite sick. And that explains why it didn't spread nearly as efficiently as this new SARS. MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome that was first described in 2012, is even more severe in its illness and even less capable of community transmission, because people get very sick with it very quickly and don't appear to transmit until they're in the hospital. And so MERS really hasn't spread very far at all. We still have sporadic cases even today, but it hasn't sparked the global pandemic that this virus has. If we think about flu and the most recent flu pandemic, which you alluded to, which is H1N1 swine flu, which spread across the world in 2009, this virus shares some significant characteristics with a flu pandemic strain, in that flu is another well-adapted virus to Homo sapiens and is very efficiently transmitted by upper respiratory tract spread. And so the mode of spread of this virus is similar to flu. Back to you, Scott.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned that it can be transmitted quite efficiently, and I take it that's associated with the R value. That's the first question, and the following questions that we're getting from the audience is, how do you get it, number one, and two, what is the best way to protect yourself?
So you get it very similarly to the way you get all upper respiratory tract viral illnesses, including other coronaviruses that we've known about for a long time that cause common colds. And the main route that you become infected in the community is what we call contact and droplet. Contact refers to an infected person coughing droplets, large secretory droplets, onto surfaces, doorknobs, tabletops, handrails. The harder the better, because the virus survives longer on harder surfaces. And then another uninfected person comes along, touches that surface, becomes contaminated with viral particles contained in the secretory droplets, and then brings them up to a mucous membrane, i.e. rubs their eyes, picks their nose, puts their finger in their mouth, and then the virus can infect a new host via that route. The other route is by direct inhalation of droplets that have been sneezed or coughed out of an infected person. But because the droplets tend to be rather large, they tend to fall under gravity rather quickly once they're expelled. And so that's the thinking behind the 6 foot contact zone to avoid getting closer, because those droplets don't travel that far and so would all fall to the ground and not be inhaled by another person. So that's really the main routes by which this virus and most other upper respiratory tract viruses are transmitted in the community.
Doctor, just to follow up on that, I know a lot of the concerns that are in the media right now revolve around the testing, the need for testing, and the ability to test adequately for the virus. In your experience and with what you know, are the current levels of testing appropriate that you're seeing now? And if not, what needs to be done?
I think probably you know the answer to the question, but as you ask it, one only needs to sort of listen to the criticisms of my former agency, the CDC, and the press. We really dropped the ball nationally on testing, and we're still behind. So we are well behind the epidemic curve in terms of detecting the front, the leading edge of where the infection is moving. And to do that, we need to be testing a lot more than we're testing now. And in fact, in the high transmission areas, including Connecticut, where I am right now, but particularly New York and New Jersey in the tri-state area, in Michigan, in Louisiana, the testing has all but ceased, mainly because we're overwhelmed with taking care of people that we already know are infected and sick. And so testing has become somewhat of a moot topic that needs to be readdressed once we've dealt with the surge of cases that are the immediate healthcare needs. But we will really need to ramp up testing as the major tool that we have for public health control if we are going to be able to relax our social distancing rules and get back to some semblance of normal business. Testing is a crucial component of that.
So just as a quick follow-up, I guess some of the things that people are asking, is it too late to do that? It sounds like we were behind the curve to begin with, but as far as where we are now and moving forward, is it something that we can still do that can help impact the spread?
So there's two answers, yes and no. Yes, it is too late for this first wave of infection that we're already seeing on the exponential rise across metropolitan areas of the United States. And that will just be a wave of infection from coast to coast. And indeed, that's going to happen regardless of whether we test or not. That horse has left the barn. But in terms of dealing with what is going to be a future control of transmission in this epidemic, because the virus isn't going to go anywhere. It's within our communities, and it's going to flare up if we allow it to going forward, either on a seasonal basis or even right now as a flare-up of a partially controlled epidemic. Yes, we do need to ramp up testing so that once we deal with this first wave, which is the worst wave because our healthcare facilities are not geared up to handle the peak of cases, we'll just have to deal with it the best we can. Once we get through that phase, and once we slow down the transmission through the social distancing that we're all doing right now, we will have to have widespread testing in place to allow any relaxation of those distancing rules, because we will need to know where the virus begins to flare up again as quickly as possible, and then isolate those cases, do the contact tracing of those cases, and maintain control over the virus this year and even into next year before we have the tools like vaccines to really help us manage this epidemic. So it's a two-phase question. We missed our chance to do what I just described the first time around, and now we're paying the price. But we will need still to tool up, invest, and create a public health infrastructure to allow us to go back to normal business or close to normal business again after this first wave.
Dr. Shepard, you mentioned a vaccine. Do you have any thoughts on what that will look like, when it will be developed, and kind of give us at least your opinion on a timeline for when we might see a vaccine developed and rolled out in the United States and in the world?
Yes. Vaccines are key to managing what really is a natural process. This is not an unusual event. It's just unusual that it has occurred with such rapidity and severity. But this is a natural process. And a vaccine is what makes the seasonal flu, which occurs annually in a very similar fashion to this pandemic, manageable, because it reduces both the transmissibility, so it reduces the R value of seasonal flu, and it also reduces the case fatality rate, which is probably what's driving so much of our fear and panic response to this particular pandemic, because the case fatality rate looks so high and makes us scared of it. Whereas the flu and its vaccine have made that a manageable risk that we're all willing to take. The first vaccine candidate, and notice I use my words carefully because it is only an experimental candidate vaccine that may or may not work, began its safety trials, so its phase 1 safety trial, 2 weeks ago with the first enrollment of patients in Washington State. And the nature of vaccine development is a very prolonged one, much more prolonged than treatments for illnesses, because the medical community tends to be extremely conservative. And our mantra, the Hippocratic Oath, dictates that we first do no harm. And if you think about it, vaccines are interventions, drugs really, given to perfectly healthy people that have no signs of illness at all. And so any toxicity in a vaccine is unacceptable, because you're essentially treating someone that doesn't have a disease and is being protected against that disease. And toxicity studies, side effect studies, the safety studies that we're in right now for the development of coronavirus vaccine, because of that, are very prolonged. A large number of patients have to be enrolled in them, and they have to be followed over an extended period of time. And only then, once an immunization is considered to be safe, do the efficacy studies start, i.e., does it actually work? Will it protect people from this infection? And that's another phase of investigation that has to take place. And so taking all those together, really a timeline of at least 12 months. In my mind, significantly longer will be required to develop a vaccine that has at least enough efficacy. It doesn't have to be 100% protective, as the flu vaccines never are, but it has to blunt the severity and the transmissibility of the infection. And that's probably going to take at least 18 months. And so we're looking at dealing with this new pandemic strain of virus, probably for at least 1 or 2 more cycles of infection across the globe before we have a vaccine.
And Doctor, real quick, I know Scott's about to ask you a question, but just to follow up on that, what does a cycle look like? What's the length of a cycle as you describe it?
We don't know. I mean, we're in the midst of the first one, so no one really knows. What I think is reasonable to speculate is that this will be a seasonal event, such that other coronaviruses that we know about are seasonal viruses. They come in the fall and winter, along with flu and some other upper respiratory tract viruses to cause illness. And so it would be reasonable to assume that this particular virus will become a seasonal virus that will rise in cases in the fall through the winter and then begin to diminish in the spring. But remember that we are in the midst of widespread community transmission moving into springtime and summer in the Northern Hemisphere in a very unique situation. The first arrival of this virus, where none of us has any level of immunity at all. So we've not been exposed before. We haven't recovered from COVID. We're entirely naive, which is the sort of technical term for someone who's completely susceptible in the population, with widespread community transmission ongoing right now on the 1st of April. And so my suspicion is that for this first round, we may not get too much of a break with seasonality because we're in a spreading brand new infection in a totally susceptible population. And therefore, any reduction in its transmissibility through the warmer months in the Northern Hemisphere will be blunted. And we may see continued transmission going into the fall season. And just as an aside, remember that the nature of global infections is that when we move into out of viral season into the spring and summer, the Southern Hemisphere is moving in to its seasonal transmission in fall and winter. And so the seasonal flu and pandemic flus tend to circulate the globe according to the seasons in any particular region at any particular time. So I'm not sure we're going to get much of a break this year.
Dr. Shepard, can you comment on what population is most at risk, what mortality rate we're seeing in the United States, and then comment briefly, if you could, on what drugs are available and treatment modalities. I know the press has talked about the hydroxychloroquine, and there's been some discussion of convalescent serums, and anything else that you may comment on that you think is promising.
So the first part of your question, I think, is a key one, because a great deal of our response, the media coverage, the somewhat panic-like and fearful view that the public have of what's going on is driven by the difficulty in coming up with an accurate case fatality rate or mortality, i.e. the severity of this new infection. And I want to just preface what I'm going to say with the fact that we do not have the data that we require for an accurate calculation of the case fatality rate. How many people die compared with how many people were infected. Because we don't know how many people were infected. We don't have the test to do that. But we do know a couple of things. Number one, other pandemics, we've always overestimated the case fatality rate early on for a number of reasons, including ascertainment bias and our difficulty in working out the denominator, the number of people infected. So I want to say that early estimates are nearly always overestimates. And we do have some data that was generated, say, in South Korea, which did the most widespread testing early on to give us a fairly good idea of the total number of people infected and good mortality data, the number of people that died from the infection. And we have some modeling done by very good modeling groups, including groups both here in the US and in the UK, extrapolating from the data that we do have. And they all are in fairly good agreement that in this early stage of this new infection, COVID, that the case fatality rate is below 1% for the population as a whole, ranging from somewhere between 0.4 to 0.8%, which means, say, on average, 0.6%, which would be 6 deaths per 1,000 people infected. And nearly all of that mortality, the highest risk groups for a bad outcome from this infection, are almost exclusively in the older age cohorts. So as the age of infected people goes up from about age 60, the rate of death goes up very significantly. So these vary, but reach 10 to 15% mortality in the over 80s. So this is quite unlike flu, for instance, which has peaks in younger people, children, in pregnant women, for instance, and then in older people. This is really exclusively a dangerous infection of older people. So there are other infections like seasonal flu, which have a case fatality rate of about 0.1%. So it gives you an idea that this is likely to be more severe for the general population, but almost exclusively in the older age groups. So that gives you a kind of perspective on how severe the infection is. I'm happy to answer questions about, why Italy and Wuhan and other places appear to report much higher case fatality rates. In terms of treatment, we don't have anything that is proven effective against coronavirus. We have anecdotes around hydroxychloroquine, which you've heard a great deal about, and we're actually using it at Yale empirically with a certain amount of queasiness because we don't have good data that it has really any effectiveness in real patients. And we're very, very concerned about doing harm instead of good with our interventions. But it seems as though it's such a well-known and used medicine that we can mitigate any risks that patients might run by being on it and see if it appears to have any benefit. We're also enrolling in a drug trial at Yale for remdesivir, which many of you have heard about, which was the failed Ebola drug. And we're enrolling patients right now in several remdesivir trials. But those have already been enrolling in China for a couple of months, and we've heard nothing from interim analyses that would suggest that it's effective. So, I'm holding my judgment, and the short answer is we actually have no antiviral treatments available to us. And so what we're using are supportive care for patients admitted. So they get supplemental oxygen and they may need mechanical ventilation to support them in the most critical cases. Steroids are another sort of open question, or anti-IL-6 drugs, which are targeted immunosuppressives. We are actually using them at Yale. I can't tell you whether they're effective or not. We're using them empirically. So there are no proven drugs that mitigate the illness right now. Back to you.
We just got a few questions have been flowing in, and I'll take this first one to offer to you. And this one says, this is from Samantha, it says, does Dr. Shepard feel the kids will be able to go back to school this fall, even if there's no vaccine? And how long does he feel social distancing will last?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer because it's wrapped up in much more than a scientific view. It's wrapped up in what communities will tolerate. There is a plan, there are plans being discussed to allow a certain amount of recirculation of business commencing again of those at lowest risk, and that would include people in school, to begin to go about their business and education again and protect those at highest risk, the elderly, from coming into contact with infected people. And how those plans are going to look is evolving right now. The strategy of socially distancing everybody is, I think everyone recognizes, not a long-term strategy. It's economically crippling. It is probably unsustainable as people begin to chafe at the isolation and the lack of mingling and activity. And so I think most public health people know that this is not sustainable for any period of time. But as I mentioned earlier, any strategy that involves kind of a graded resumption of activities as communities will absolutely depend upon us developing again a robust public health infrastructure so that we can detect the virus beginning to flare up again wherever it may be, and then doing the basic public health interventions of isolation and contact tracing that would be required to keep a lid on it going forward. And so we've got to establish that before we can begin to think about going about our business again. And as a second point, I would say that as a country, we have only partially implemented social distancing. And so if there are areas of the country that decline to use the only thing that we have available to us at the moment, which is distancing ourselves, they will remain areas of active community viral transmission. And they will act as fuel to the fire of anywhere in the United States that begins to relax its restrictions again. And so it remains to be seen how those areas, those states that are not yet distancing themselves, will be managed over the next 30 days whilst we all remain in isolation. So there's a lot of what ifs in that response. In terms of is there a big risk to allowing kids to go back to school and young people to go back to college? There really isn't a great risk. As I mentioned, nearly all of the severity of the disease is reserved for older people. So maybe their teachers are at risk, but the students themselves are at very low risk.
Well, as a quick follow-up to that, is the concern that if students can transmit the disease but may not necessarily fall victim to it, that they may still pass it to their parents who might be older or their grandparents who are older and could be more susceptible? Is that part of the reasoning behind it?
Yes. I mean, they would certainly act as a community reservoir of virus and transmission, even if they didn't develop very severe illness themselves. Yes.
Okay. One other question that's come in, another two-part question. This one's from Lori. When is an infected person no longer contagious, and can a person be reinfected?
So the answer to both of those questions is we don't know, but an educated hunch based upon knowledge of many other community-acquired viral infections is once symptoms resolve, so once a patient gets better, their immune system has already controlled the viral replication within their body, and so they're no longer shedding significant amounts of virus. So once they're asymptomatic, they're essentially not capable of transmitting to another person. Can they get reinfected? Probably not, or at least not to any great extent, because now their immune system has become educated to that virus, has developed specific antibodies, possibly T cells that would be ready to attack any new infection with exactly the same virus. We don't know that 100%, but we kind of know that from previous infections. There really isn't much. There aren't many viruses out there that can reinfect someone with exactly the same strain pretty much right after they've resolved an infection. The one exception that I'm aware of is HIV, which actually can do that, but not coronaviruses. A question, an open question, is how long are you protected after you've been infected and gotten better? And that's a hard question to answer. Other viruses, coronaviruses, that cause common colds, do appear to protect you against getting reinfected with that particular one that season. But it does look as though you lose that immunity over time, so it wanes until in the following season or two, you can become reinfected again. But it's quite possible that that reinfection would be much less severe because you have at least some measure of immunity remaining.
Dr. Shepard, we're getting lots of questions coming in. I'm going to try to hit as many as we can, but one of them comes in from Rob, and it asks, if this primarily affects the elderly population, should we not protect that group by simply having them isolate rather than asking the entire country to do so?
So, I mean, that's a strategy. It's just a question of how to implement that strategy and whether it's consistent with civil rights, whether it's consistent with, you know, even the capabilities of each state to do that. I think that as we lift our social distancing restrictions, whenever that occurs, and at the current time it looks like it might be in May, so next month, you will see something along those lines where there will be instructions to older people to be much more careful about their social interactions and their activities than younger people. And that in some fashion, businesses, government offices, other sites that can cooperate with any relaxation will have policies to enable that to happen. So for instance, you know, already supermarkets are having early hours for seniors to do their shopping without mingling with the general population, and then opening up to the general population to do their shopping. That sort of thing. And those are discussions that are currently happening both at the federal and state levels, community levels, about how to protect those at greatest risk, but allow everybody else to get back to business. Okay, and another question we have here, Dr. Shepard, is from Cindy, asking about the adverse effects from the hydroxychloroquine alone, particularly as to potential damage to the heart, using that drug alone or in conjunction
with azithromycin, which is an antibiotic, as I understand it.
Yeah, we stopped using azithromycin. The two of them together are quite arrhythmogenic, which means they promote dangerous cardiac rhythms. And in critical patients, it's just too much to handle for real no proof of efficacy. So we're not using them together. We're only using hydroxychloroquine as a possible effective intervention. But I will say that the remdesivir trials are exclusive of use of hydroxychloroquine. So if we enroll a patient in the remdesivir trial, they can't be on hydroxychloroquine. And I personally am quite comfortable with that because I see no objective scientific data that would support my use in a patient. It's really a hope rather than a fact that it's effective against SARS-2. And so I'm quite happy to do switch to something that at least has been studied scientifically to generate evidence that would guide my practice in a much more risk-benefit sensible way. So yeah, we're trying to do something, but we're trying to avoid just doing something to be doing something and to harm patients as a result.
You mentioned, Dr. Shepard, the need for a robust public health infrastructure, and I'm curious as to your opinion as to whether any countries have such an infrastructure, and if you could give any more comments on what exactly that would look like so that we can go about our business and not create corollary damage to the economy.
Some countries do have that infrastructure. If you look at the countries in Asia, as neighbors of China, who built that structure up after the SARS epidemic 18 years ago, and were quite shaken by the possibility that there would be more of these coming. Countries like Singapore, which is a city-state, Hong Kong, which isn't a country, it's a special administrative area of China, Taiwan, which is, denied nationhood by the Chinese, South Korea, have all performed so much better than the Western democracies in their handling of this new epidemic by doing just the very basic, simple, straightforward public health interventions that I described. So early detection of cases by aggressive testing, isolation of cases as quickly as possible, contact tracing of cases, and monitoring those contacts and isolating contacts that become infected or symptomatic as quickly as possible. And just doing those things. And they have all managed to essentially peak and decline their epidemics much, much sooner than any Western country has been able to do. So they've had a much slower onset of cases. Their hospital systems have largely maintained the capability to take care of all the critical care patients they needed to. And their peak and decline happened much earlier than we're managing to be able to do it. And so what we're going to have to do is something like that. We're going to have to implement public health measures akin to Taiwan or South Korea.
Doctor, another question that we've received, is it known how long from exposure until you test positive?
It varies. The incubation period for onset of symptoms is between 2 and 11 days. So the 14-day quarantine period is sort of overkill, but it's designed so that we don't miss any cases. The average time from infection to symptoms is 5.1 days. So that's the median time. The virus in certain studies of family groups that have become infected, begins to shed in significant quantities in the upper airway in some people, and I can't give you a proportion because we haven't done systematic studies. In some people, the virus is shedding quite significantly, and they are presumably infectious up to 2 days before they develop symptoms. And that's a key factor because that is what makes the R number significantly high with this virus, because people that are infected, that are pumping out large numbers of viral particles, still feel fine for a day or two and are out doing their daily business or going to the gym or whatever they feel like doing for that period during their infectivity. And that's why this virus has been so successful.
So another question, are we more likely to see more pandemic viruses like this in the future?
Yes.
Does this show us anything or teach us anything about what's to come?
Yes. I mean, just to give you a sort of sense, coronaviruses honestly were, a little bit of a backwater. There were viruses, a few groups worked on them, but they weren't, sexy per se. We had a presentation from one of the main coronavirus experts at the big HIV meeting that was done virtually in Boston this last month. And he told us that fruit bats are almost certainly the animal reservoir of the coronaviruses that have caused the last 3 epidemics, including this one, MERS and SARS. And in fruit bats, there are at least 1,000 different coronaviruses. And there are only about 50 that have been sequenced, identified definitively. And out of those 50, 3 are so closely related to this novel SARS-2 coronavirus as to be ready-made to make that jump from an animal into a human with the same efficiency and adaptation to spread that this virus has. So essentially, we know of 3 out of the tiny window that we're looking through. We don't know about the vast number of other kinds of viruses that we don't even know about. But we know that they're lining up essentially to make that jump. Obviously, they don't have brains and they're not sort of evil geniuses, but the situation that makes it possible for an animal to come into contact closely with a human and share its viruses will just facilitate these new viruses ready-made to do this, to make the jump into us. And that will undoubtedly happen in the future.
Dr. Shepard, we've got still lots of questions in the remaining 13 minutes. Let me try to run through a few of them here. One is from Brian asking, are patients still infectious after their symptoms have resolved, and if so, for how long?
I think I answered earlier that in general with viral infections, once your symptoms resolve, you're not infectious. So even if, and we can detect this virus with the PCR test that we have now, after someone has gotten better, but their immune system has essentially controlled viral replication and reduced it to a level that they're no longer shedding significant virus. And so they're no longer a big infectious risk. So my presumption is that it's unlikely that someone who's resolved their infection will be infectious.
All right, another question. If you clean your hands regularly, do not touch your face, and engage in social distancing, what is your opinion as to the risk of contracting the virus?
Very low.
What is your opinion as to when we'll see a peak in new cases? I know this morning there were just under 190,000 in the United States, with 1,400 of those approximately here in Virginia. when do you think we'll see a peak in the US?
I think we're going to see rolling peaks. So what we're looking at are epidemics on different timelines. Washington State, California were on an earlier peak, and their social distancing may have blunted those peaks. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, the Northeast is on an exponential rise that looks to be continuing until at least mid-April. And that peak may be flat, maybe a plateau rather than a peak, because so many infections probably occurred over the previous 2 weeks before social distancing occurred. I think peaks will be achieved slightly later in Detroit, say, Chicago, New Orleans, Florida. It's hard to say for sure, but just to give you a frame of reference, in China, as I mentioned, the first infection, the first introduction in humans probably occurred, say, around November the 20th. And with their extreme social distancing and total lockdown in Wuhan and Hubei province in China, their peak came on February the 20th. So that's 3 months. Our first case came that we detected in Washington State on January the 20th. And our lockdown has not been nearly as complete as the Chinese lockdown in Wuhan and Hubei province. But if we just use that 3 month as a rough frame of reference, then April the 20th would be a date for at least a peak, potentially of, say, California and Washington State. And then perhaps after that for the later epidemics that are rising exponentially right now in other metropolitan centers. But, you know, it's a moving target and no one really knows.
Doctor, you've talked a little bit about how it's transmitted from human to human, and the fact that it may be originating from animals. What is the mechanism of transmission from the animals to the humans? Is it through consuming those animals? Is it also through some sort of particulate that the animal is expelling? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we don't. The short answer is we don't know, but it's unlikely to be consuming the animals because they're cooked. And that would kill the virus. So what is most likely is either in handling or butchering the animal. A human came into contact with high viral load secretions from that animal or the blood of the animal. So the virus also travels in blood, and those secretions from the animal contaminated the human either through a cut in their hand or splashed onto a mucous membrane, their mouth, their eye, up their nose. And the virus can then lock on to the receptors on the surface of human epithelial cells and cause an infection in that person. So that's probably the most likely scenario.
And also, just from the sort of life cycle of the virus itself, does this type of surface that it is on dictate the length of time in which it can live? Can you talk a little bit about different surfaces and whether or not it can live on food, hot food, cold food, those types of things?
Yeah. I mean, the sort of total number of different surfaces has not been examined. There have been a couple of environmental studies that compared its survivability on different surfaces with the original SARS, and they look identical, basically. Coronaviruses tend to be fairly robust. which is fairly bad news. They tend to survive reasonably long in the environment compared with some other viruses, but they don't survive forever. And they decline relatively rapidly. If a day or two is long enough for most viral particles to be inactivated on most surfaces. The surfaces that appear to keep virus viable for longer are the harder surfaces like countertops, like doorknobs, things that they're not absorbed into. You've seen the studies that looked at the survivability on cardboard, which was several hours. I haven't seen any studies looking at the viability of virus on food. I just haven't seen them. I'm not sure if they're out there. It may be too soon. But I would say as a rule of thumb, anything that's hot will kill the virus because they don't survive in significant heat. So cooking definitely inactivates almost all viral pathogens. Whereas cold food, like a salad, you could conceive that viral contamination could last longer.
Dr. Shepard, I think we have time probably for 2 more questions. The first comes in from Nancy asking about immunity. Can individuals develop immunity, and are we too far behind the curve to have much benefit from social isolation?
Individuals, yes, will develop a certain level of immunity. Whether it will be complete immunity, i.e. you cannot get infected again, we don't know. And as I mentioned earlier, immunity is rarely lifelong. And in fact, with coronaviruses, we know that it is relatively short. So you may be protected for a season or 2. But you may have some residual immunity even after that. It is not too late to social isolate. In fact, that's all that has been left to us. As I mentioned at the beginning, if we had done the Taiwan or South Korean model of public health intervention in an aggressive fashion 2 months ago, we wouldn't be here now, but we didn't. And so social distancing is our main viral control method at the current time. But what that does do is reduce the number of people getting infected with the virus. And so you'll see the corollary of that with the first part of your question. If you're not exposed, then you don't develop any immunity at all. And so social distancing is also maintaining a highly susceptible population because we're avoiding getting infected with the virus in the first place. And that simply emphasizes what I said before, which is when we start to emerge from our social isolation, the key component will be aggressive public health monitoring and intervention, because we're still totally susceptible as a group, and we have no herd immunity that is generated. We have no vaccine, we have no drugs, and so we have to be vigilant.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and this question comes in from both Linda and Rob, and that is whether or not this virus can be passed from humans to their domestic pets.
There's some inkling that may be possible. There have been a couple of reports from Asia of, I think, 2 dogs and a cat, where they did investigate quite intensively whether they'd truly been infected. And it did look as though they may have been infected. And there's no reason why that may not be the case. As you've already heard, this virus came from a wild animal. It has the ability to jump species barriers in mammals. And it's not out of the bounds of possibility that domestic animals, pets, could be infected from us. Whether they can infect us in turn is not known at the current time.
Well, very good. I think we're out of time for your portion, but Dr. Shepard, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking some time to share your wisdom with us, and most importantly, thank you for your work at Yale and what you're doing on the front line, you as well as all the first responders. We're so thankful for your expertise. Thank you for your time today. So we'll go ahead and drop you off at this point, but thank you, sir.
Thank you,
My
Dr. Shepard.
pleasure. Good luck.
Thank you.
All
Bye-bye.
right, so we're trying to respect everyone's time and stay right on time here, and it's 1 o'clock. So for the remaining 30 minutes, Brian and I wanted to briefly go through some of the legal topics. So let me get this timeline or this PowerPoint shared if I could. All right, there we go. All right, so the next pathway is for occupational diseases, and these also are not likely. And the reason being is that Virginia, this section of the code 400 does not cover diseases to which the general public is exposed, and this most certainly qualifies as that type of disease. All right, so 401 is the next portion of the code, and it's probably where I want to spend most of the time talking about, because this is where the bulk of the claims will be analyzed, at least in my opinion, for the commission. And remember, the standard under 401 of the code is not a preponderance, but is by clear and convincing evidence. The burden is clear and convincing evidence and not a mere probability. So what you need to show in Virginia is that the coronavirus arose out of and in the course of the employment and did not result from causes outside of the employment. And so that's a pretty stringent burden you'll see, and you need to show both of those under paragraph 1. So what we see as potential really defense arguments that you'll see when these claims come forward will be that the burden of proof, again, clear and convincing evidence, cannot be established, specifically that it cannot be shown that one, did not result from causes outside of the employment, or two, that it arose out of and in the course of the employment. So what's going to be very important as we look at these cases as they come through the commission and the cycle is whether there's been known documented exposures. All right, and so this PowerPoint will be made available for all the participants. These next slides are just illustrative cases. And what's interesting as you look through the cases, as we've done in Virginia, that most of the cases under 401 deal with carpal tunnel syndrome or hearing loss. Very few deal with diseases outside of those two disease claims. And so we have given you most of the case sites, and we're happy to let you read those for light nighttime reading. They're here. 402A, so I mentioned, I think most of the cases will come under 401, and then we'll see some under 402A as well. This is the respiratory disease presumption, and it doesn't cover all employees. You'll see under item 3 there that it only covers a protected class of employees, namely firefighters and Department of Emergency Management hazardous materials officers. And again, this is a presumption. So the way this works in Virginia is if you can show you have a respiratory disease, and I put it in quotes because that's what it provides for in the statute. And I think that the commission is very likely to find this to qualify as a respiratory disease. As you heard from Dr. Shepard, it has the classic markings of a respiratory disease. Typically, that's where the mortality rate comes in because of the issues that folks have with lung function. And again, this is a presumption. So if you can show that you're either a firefighter or an employee of Department of Emergency Management, and you have death or a total or partial disability, you're going to be entitled to this presumption. And it will then shift over to the employer to overcome that presumption. And so how do you overcome the presumption? You have to show that two things in both of these have to be shown. There are conjunctive requirements. One, that the respiratory disease was not caused by work, and second, that there was or were non-work related causes of the disease. And that's going to be particularly problematic if there are lots of cases and exposures outside of work. So potential defenses for this presumption provision would be that the coronavirus is not a respiratory disease. We certainly don't know what this is going to look like because it's not been tested by the commission. The statute most certainly doesn't reference that specific condition. It just talks about respiratory disease. And it's important to note that for some folks, they're very mild symptomology that occurs, and it may be argued that it's not a respiratory disease. Probably that will be a loser argument, but we will see it. Or second, that the presumption has been rebutted. And so here are some illustrative cases with this particular statute for your reference as well. And then finally, before I turn it over to Brian, talk about one last, the fifth path that I think will be addressed or at least tested by claimants' lawyers, and that is 402.1, which is an infectious disease presumption. And like the last provision, this is yet another presumption that protects certain categories of employees. It's a broader category. You can look at the statute, but in item 2 there, we reference that it's actually 15 different protected categories of first responders. And the issue that I see with this statute is that while the draftsmanship in the language of the statute is not particularly as clear as I think it should be, there's some ambiguity that I think will be tested. Nonetheless, I think this statute is a narrow statute to cover hepatitis, meningitis, TB, and HIV. I do not think it's going to pick up coronavirus. And again, to rebut that presumption, you'd need to show, similar to the last presumption, that the disease was not caused by work and that there was or were non-work related causes of the disease. So last 2 slides, and then I'll pitch it to Brian. Some key.
Hey, Scott, real quick before you move on, do you think the legislature, one of the questions that just popped up from the audience, do you think the legislature is going to have to act to affirmatively put the coronavirus under within the code to actually create the presumptions that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think most certainly, Brian, that would be required as to that infectious disease presumption. I think it's going to fail without a statutory amendment. All right, so some key takeaways. One is that the claims resulting in respiratory symptoms to firefighters and Department of Emergency Management hazardous material officers, I think that they will clearly, without question, trigger that presumption. And in my opinion, they will be very difficult to rebut in Virginia. So my advice to clients would be that if you have those claims, they should be covered. Second, the remaining asserted claims outside of that classification from those 2 categories of employees, in my opinion, and I think Brian shares this opinion, but I'll let him jump in, is that they'll be analyzed under 401 of the code, and they'll be very fact specific, and that the compensability decision is going to be largely driven by 3 factors. 1, what medical opinions have been expressed. 2, what have been the known exposures both in and away from work. And then 3, whether the person is a healthcare employee under 401 2.1. And if you recall my slide on that, under paragraph 2, there's a specific reference to healthcare employees, and those include hospital, lab, nursing home, sanitarium, emergency rescue personnel, and those that are engaged in the direct delivery of healthcare. I think those categories of folks will certainly have a leg up with a path towards compensability. So what are some tips for the adjusters here? 1, you want to make sure that if you have these claims that in fact you have a positive coronavirus diagnosis as opposed to just symptoms. 2, you want to get a recorded statement promptly, and if you, for purposes of defending the claims, determine in the recorded statement whether there's been exposure outside of work, if possible, travel to known hotspots, whether that's domestic or international. And then finally, is there a definitive medical opinion on causation? Again, recognizing that the burden is by clear and convincing evidence. I don't believe the commission's going to infer causation very easily. Brian, let me kick it over to you unless you see any other questions that have come in.
It looks like there's one. I'll go ahead and read it to you. Will the injured workers who are released to restricted duty but not under an award have to continue marketing with the stay-at-home order? You know what? I'm going to save that question because I'm going to be going over it during my portion of the PowerPoint. So why don't we just hold on to that one for now, and beyond that, we'll get you to stop sharing your screen, Scott, and I'll go ahead and turn over to my portion.
Very good.
All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the employer civil liability to third-party claims. And, you know, the best way to think about this are going to be those situations where somebody is exposed to the virus at someone else's place of employment and then tries to bring a claim against that person. There's possible civil liability for claims like this if it's brought by a person who is described as a stranger to the employment. You know, one of the ways to probably think about this are those people who would go into a place where there's a high rate of transmission, for instance, the hospital setting. And the question is going to be if you're going to, if you're going into a hospital to check on or to visit someone who is there, and then you contract the virus from being in there, you're likely a stranger to that employment situation. And what does that create in terms of civil liability against the employer? And what we're seeing during, when we're looking at this, I mean, obviously we haven't had any of these cases come up yet, but I know it's a matter of time. But we're probably gonna have to demonstrate that the employer or an agent of the employer engaged in some sort of negligence that caused the third party to contract the virus. Let me go ahead and move over here. During cases like that, the burden of proof is likely going to be the reasonable person or business standard. We're going to have to show by a preponderance of the evidence that the virus was contracted as the result of the negligence of the employer. So obviously the obvious question that comes to mind with that, what does that look like? How does an employer become negligent? And so some key takeaways that we see are likely going to be analyzed. We're going to be looking at whether the employer is complying with the CDC recommendations with no known infected personnel, not likely being found negligent. If employers are following CDC guidelines and recommendations, the likelihood that they're going to be found to not be displaying reasonableness with their actions is likely going to be low. Causation would likely still be difficult to prove in the absence of a known infected employee. Again, it's easier to think about in those situations where we're thinking about sort of high risk employers such as hospitals. I don't see this coming up as often with private employers, but the issue with a private employer will likely be whether or not the employer knows or should know that there is an infected employee there. If they know that and they're not taking steps to isolate that employee, have that person stay at home, and then someone does come in to that business, I think you could have a claim there, and there would likely be some liability based on the negligence of that employer not taking the precautions that we think that they probably should take.
Let me just jump in before you turn
Sure.
to the next topic. I think it's of interest. We've seen obviously in the news a lot of cases dealing with cruise ships, a lot of cases dealing with nursing homes. And I know with the Princess cruise ship, the one that boarded in Florida on March the 9th, there was a couple that just filed a lawsuit 2 weeks ago in Los Angeles federal court alleging negligence by Princess and seeking a significant damage amount. So the allegations in that particular case was that there were 21 infected people on board, that Princess Cruise knew on the prior cruise that there was one person that was infected. They didn't warn passengers when they came onto the ship and didn't engage in appropriate warnings and cleaning protocols. So I think we're going to see these cases, and probably particularly the ones that I think are going to be problematic will be nursing homes, cruise ships, hotels, settings where there's a confined space and there's a lot of people coming and going. So as the areas through the country have greater hotspots, I think in part that will create more requirement that the employers take additional precautions.
Absolutely. So next topic we're going to talk about is the idea of working from home. Everyone now, most companies have moved to some amount of working from home for their employees, whether that is the entire company working from home or whether or not that is some designated individuals within the organization working from home. I know most companies are at least trying to keep the numbers within the office down to 10 or fewer, which for most companies that have any amount of size means that quite a few people are working from home. So when we're thinking about the work from home setting, what are the challenges that we are going to see employers having with dealing with claims, especially workers' compensation claims, coming out of the work from home scenario? So some of the risks that we see, the injuries at home can certainly create compensable claims. There's no question about that. Even prior to the virus outbreak, especially within the insurance community, a lot of individuals work from home already. So that's not new to a lot of people within our industry, but it is certainly new to other employers and to some carriers as well that still have most of their employees working in the office. But what would make those types of claims compensable, or any kind of claim arising from the need or the increase in working from home? You're still going to have to show and prove that the injury arose out of in the course of the employment. That is a standard that comes with all workers' compensation claims, and that standard will not change during this crisis. One of the things that we also want to be discussing at this point is just kind of giving some guidance to employers during this transition to a work from home setting. What does that look like, and what should they be communicating to their employees? And so we've come up with a few ideas of things that employers should be thinking about during times like this. One, we need to be communicating clearly to our employees with regard to the timeline of the policy. Clear communication during times like this is obviously one of the most important things that we advise our clients to continue to engage in. Oftentimes, you don't know what you don't know, and we're right now receiving updates from the governor and the president on almost a daily basis. So the timeline of a policy, a work from home policy, needs to be clearly communicated so that people can adequately take the steps to prepare their surroundings at home for an extended amount of time to actually work from home. Two, we want to encourage employees to designate a discrete office within their home. And the big reason for this is, from a risk management perspective, we want to reduce the number of places within the home where an injury could occur. And when we can clearly define what your workspace is, from a defense perspective, which is obviously the mindset that the lawyers in our firm have, we want to be able to make that area small. If your quote unquote work area is upstairs and downstairs and in your garage and in your backyard and your porch, the number of places that a person could get injured can increase. So as an employer, I think what you want to be able to encourage your employees to do is to have a designated place to maintain their in-home office so that they're not working throughout the home, which could obviously increase the risk of injury to a greater degree. Three, we want to emphasize that this is not flex scheduling. Work should still be done within business hours. Again, what we want to be able to do for our clients is to recommend policies that make the timeline of exposure to injuries shorter. If the idea is that you're working from home and you're just going to work from whenever you get up till whenever you choose to go to bed, the number of hours in the day obviously now becomes greater, and the likelihood of an injury of any sort can also increase. So this is not flex scheduling. This is still working from home, but during your normal business hours, to make sure that that you're minimizing the amount of time that people could be exposed to at home, in-home injuries. Also, we want to avoid out-of-home travel except as authorized. Again, this all comes down to communication with your employees. But what we're trying to do is create a smaller window, both of time and of opportunities for injuries to occur. For those employers that routinely have their employees traveling, we know that oftentimes they are obviously exposed to the risk of driving on the street and in their cars. And whether they're being rear-ended or T-boned or whatever, those injuries occur because they are forced to do that for their job. So unless out-of-home travel is necessary, you want to have a clear policy that demonstrates and that communicates to the employees that you shouldn't be just driving throughout the day if it's not for work purposes. Next, we want to specify job duties and expectations in writing. Again, we want those people who are working from home to be engaged in the activities that they need to do for their job. And those things that get them out of the business of doing their tasks are things that, from a defense perspective, should not create an increased risk of injury. And if they do, we then have a defense to the claim based on the idea that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So that's something, again, that we want to emphasize. And lastly, for as far as proper guidance, we want to make sure that that the elements should be made into a clear work from home policy within your employee handbook. There are times, and especially our clients, that we advise on employee handbooks and that we create employee handbooks for. Oftentimes, you don't know what needs to be in a handbook until an issue arises. And this issue has certainly, the coronavirus has certainly shed a spotlight on those things that may be deficient in certain companies' handbooks. And it's a good time to be able to take stock in whether or not you have a work from home policy. A lot of companies are doing this for the first time. And this is something that needs to be put into your employee handbook for the future. This is the marketing obligations. We just received a question about marketing, and I said that we were going to discuss it, and I think there's no better time than now. Marketing obligations: what effects does COVID-19 coronavirus have on the injured worker's duty to market? Obviously, everyone in this industry knows what marketing is. It's the obligation of an injured worker when they are in a restricted duty capacity to the obligation to look for work and to go look for work within their regular job duties and job expectations in order to be eligible for temporary total disability benefits. Obviously, with the stay-at-home measures, some of this is going to create some challenges in marketing. But what are those challenges going to be? COVID-19 will likely limit or possibly eliminate an injured worker's duty to market. Now, when I say eliminate, that's obviously something that would have to take more than, that would have to take some sort of judicial step or a legislative step to completely eliminate. But there are going to be practical considerations when we are dealing with these types of cases where the duty to market will likely be limited quite to a great degree. We obviously have the social distancing that the governor has put into place, Executive Order 55, the stay-at-home order. What duty is going to, how is the duty going to be restricted during a time like this? The blunt answer right now is there's still a duty to market. The question is going to be whether or not your duty to market will be compromised, and whether or not a judge or deputy commissioner will use their discretion in determining whether your efforts are still good. I know Scott and I've talked about this. Scott, you may want to jump in as far as what you think, how a judge would look at a person's marketing efforts during the time that they are marketing during, the social distancing and this executive order.
Yeah, I agree with you, Brian. There's a task force that's been assembled of the defense bar and the claimants bar. And we actually had a call this morning at 9 o'clock. That's one of the hot topics. The claimants bar is trying to get the commission to make a proclamation that there's no duty to market. And of course, we push back on that. I think that there's most certainly the ability to still apply for jobs and do things by way of internet applications, et cetera. So, but I tend to agree with you. I think it's going to be very difficult for employers to prevail on that. It's already fairly weak in Virginia as far as the requirements are fairly weak in Virginia. So we'll stay tuned. I don't think the commission's going to make a proclamation on that. I think they're going to rely on the typical case law, the seminal case of McGuinn, and look at that 6-factor test. But most certainly it's going to, I think, have less obligations for the claimants moving forward through this period.
All right, I'm going to jump through. I did make some notes as far as what the governor's proclamation has been, the executive order. I know everyone probably has access to that. I'm going to go through those slides and go just to the practical takeaways of marketing during this virus. Looking for work is not specifically allowed, but the restrictions will likely place practical limitations on marketing. Online marketing may be the best option and should be limited by job availability. While down, some segments are still seeing spikes in demand. I think we were talking about Amazon is increasing their workforce, Lowe's and some other places are. So the idea that a person can't market at all is certainly not what we're seeing is going to happen. And as Scott was saying, we don't think that the commission will put out any proclamation about it. The next issue that we're going to talk about, paid sick leave when a person is under an award for indemnity benefits. Should they also be allowed to receive some of the benefits that the Coronavirus Act has allowed? So the Families First Coronavirus Response Act signed into law March 19th of 2020, and it includes an Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. And this applies to employers with 500 or fewer employees. They must provide paid sick leave. So the question becomes, what happens if someone's getting paid sick leave, but they are also getting indemnity benefits? The short answer is the employers should be able to get a credit for any comp benefits that are being paid while they're also getting sick leave. The general rule there is that a person shouldn't be entitled to what's considered a double recovery for a compensable injury. And so the employers in those situations should be able to receive a credit. Let's see. And so another issue that comes up is when when the employers are seeking a credit based on the claimant's double recovery. This is going to come up when the injured worker is under temporary total, or if the claimant is totally disabled as a result of COVID-19 caused by a risk of the employment. So in both those situations, you're going to see a credit sought by the employer. That's, I think, the last issue that I think we were going to cover. If there are any other questions, Scott, if you've received some questions, you can ask some of those and we can touch on those quickly as well.
Great. Yeah, one question that did come in, Brian, it's the question from Rob, is what obligation does the employer have for a claimant that has been furloughed due to quarantine issues with the coronavirus while receiving temporary partial disability benefits. And I'll jump in. I think the clear answer is none. This is a furlough that impacts all employees, and as such, it's an economic consequence. It's a furlough due to issues that are not connected to the work accident disability, and there is no liability. In the case, the supporting case for that is King William County versus Jones case that's gotten a lot of attention. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that, Brian.
No, I mean, I think that's it. I mean, the real takeaway there during a furlough is whether or not the injured worker is going to be able to show that their loss of wages is because of their work injury. And if they can't, that's going to really restrict their ability to be able to show entitlement to benefits. I've got another question here regarding a refusal of medical treatment in light of the governor's executive order. The question is just whether, if they're not able to receive medical treatment, will that be looked at as a refusal of medical treatment? So obviously, you know, if a person has been restricted from being able to get medical treatment, we don't think that the commission will then find that the claimant is refusing medical treatment, or stated another way, that refusal could be justified. So if you've got an injured worker who is supposed to be receiving treatment and their provider is not allowing it, that would likely be a justified refusal of medical treatment. Scott, do you have any more?
Yeah, another question came in. The question was, how long will hearings be delayed in Virginia? And that's a good question. Currently, the commission has continued all cases through April. It was indicated to us this morning during the task force call that there's been 1,400 cases displaced. So obviously these are piling up. The commission has indicated that they're looking into a WebEx application that they have an aggressive goal to roll out by April 15. I don't know whether they'll hit it, and that will end up with a protocol where hearings are going to be held through the WebEx platform. So you'll have folks participating remotely, and we're still trying to work through all of that. But I think that the commission's going to be doing that, and we'll probably see in the next 2 weeks some guidance there.
I think those are all the questions that we've got. Any parting words, Scott, for everyone who has participated today?
I'm going to throw it to you, Brian, for parting words. But no.
Oh, good. I'm happy to give some.
All right. Well,
I appreciate everybody taking time to out of their schedules to participate in this. Obviously, having an infectious disease specialist participate was exciting for us because we get just as many questions and have just as many questions as probably many people who are listening today. So it was a treat for me, certainly to be able to talk to someone like Dr. Shepard, and appreciate everybody's time and willingness to participate in this today.
yeah, and the only a final comment I would say is to, if you have questions, and we try to answer as many as we could, but we'll go through the ones that we did not get to the extent you've asked the questions, and try to get an email back to you all. We were not able to get to all of them, but we tried our best. Thank you for the participation. Even though this went out very late, we had just over 300 of you on a call, and we appreciate it. Obviously, this is a scary time for everybody, and please be careful out there and support local business. We certainly need it here in Virginia. And then also we do have our annual conference that I would remind folks that we'd love to see you in the fall. And I don't recall the date off the top of my head. Brian, I think it was the last slide. Do you have that there by chance?
Oh yeah. Well, I don't have it being shared.
It's on September 17th.
Yeah,
Excellent.
September 17th.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.